things can be more disappointing than to observe the disaster of an argument going on in a family after the death of a loved one. An argument over things, possessions, grandma's china, grandpa's fishing reels, or even worse, money. The arguments over money have divided families. I've seen it happen again and again. I've seen arguments in my own family. I've seen arguments in the families of churches that I've served throughout the years, where you have people who have come to almost to physical blows over the question of who is going to get what. And that's the story, that's the question, that's the situation that confronts Jesus here in our reading today from Luke's Gospel. Now, this story and this parable is unique to Luke's Gospel. Luke's Gospel tends to like to focus in on the practical things, the literal things, those actual nitty-gritty elements, the difficult questions, the difficult ideas, those hard concepts and ideas. Luke's Gospel likes to focus in on it. Instead of, like in Matthew's Gospel, where the author will soften the blow, Luke just lays it out there. For example, in Matthew's Gospel it says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit," whereas in Luke's Gospel it simply says, "Blessed are the poor." It just kind of comes home in a hard-hitting way that we don't always find comfortable. And here we have an example of that today in our reading from Luke chapter 12. Very powerful passage where Jesus' response to the man who asked that he arbitrate this situation between himself and his brother, he says, "Friend, who set me judge over you or arbiter over you? Take care, beware, be on your guard against all kinds of greed. For one's life, one's existence, one's worth is not consisting in the abundance of possessions." And yet, if you take a look at modern society, you would think that it is exactly that. Possessions that qualifies one as being worth something. After all, the maxim that we seem to have in our world today is, those who die with the most toys wins, right? Right. Unfortunately, yes. That is what the world is trying to teach us. You know, the old golden rule? Those who have the gold rules. Yeah. That's what the world is trying to teach us. Amass all the gold, all the things, all the stuff, and you will be worth much. You will be considered great. But that's not what Jesus is saying. He tells us to beware of that mentality. He reminds us very clearly, be on guard against all kinds of greed. Whoa. What was the movie Wall Street? Greed is good. Remember that line? That's what the society teaches us. That's what modern Western society wants to proclaim. And yet I'm reminded of a meme that I saw that was going around Facebook not long ago. And it said the difference between the rich and the poor. And on the left side of the meme, it had a mansion on the top, and it had a shack underneath it. And then on the other side, it had a grave and a grave. Actually, it was a hole in the ground and another hole in the ground. A reminder, a stark reminder, a painful reminder, a realistic reminder that no one gets out of this life alive or with the stuff we have amassed. And that's actually the point of the entire parable. The land of a rich man produced abundantly. And he thought to himself, what should I do? For I have no place to store my crops. Then he said, I will do this. I will pull down my barns and build larger ones. And there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, soul, you have much ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, and be merry. Now, one of the elements that is usually missed here is that this man is already wealthy. He's already so rich. He has land that produces so much for him that his barns that he already had were already filled. He didn't have any room to put more stuff. And one speculation is that he had full barns because he was hoarding his stuff so that he could sell it at a time when he would get more money for it. He was hoarding the grain so that when a famine came, he could sell it for a much higher price and make far more. He had more than anybody could ever eat. More than anybody could ever use reasonably. Himself or his family couldn't possibly consume it. It wasn't for him. It was for sale. And he was hoarding on to it. Rather than sell what he had and put the new stuff into the barns, he wanted to hoard more, to sell it at a time when it would be worth much more. Another point that is usually missed is, why didn't he just build some extra barns? Why did he have to tear down the barns he had to build bigger, newer ones? Well, he didn't want to take up land. He knew that he could plant more crops on his land and make even more if he didn't take up some of that land by building more barns. So he wanted to preserve the land he had for farming and not take it up with storage. Yes, greed is active here. We're not just talking about what he needed or his family needed to eat and live. We're talking about enough to sell. And he wanted more and more and more, and wasn't even willing to take up a little bit of his land to build more barns. So he tore down to make bigger. And a third point that is usually missed here is the man isn't talking to anybody. He's not talking to family. He's not talking to any friends. He's talking throughout this entire sequence thus far to himself. I mean, that's even made clear here when he speaks to himself and he says, soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Well, some translations render that as self. He's talking to himself. Why? Probably because he's already run off everybody who might challenge him, everybody who might come to him with a handout, everybody that might need or want something. I have a friend who's extremely wealthy. I mean, we all know people who have a lot of money. This person has a lot of money. And she told me one day recently, she said, Greg, I have very few real friends. Because most of the people I know, once they find out how much I have, they are asking me for money or things. And they expect that if I love them, I'm going to give it to them. I have only a very few friends now. And they are all people whom I would give everything to, but who have never asked me for a thin dime. This man has run off everybody. He has so much. He has run off everybody. He is alone. That's why he carries on these conversations with himself. Because there's no one left to talk to. Fascinating points here. Take a look at God's response. But God said to him. Now, up until now, this is conversations the man is having with himself. Now God steps into the picture. But God said to him, you fool. Now, right there, that kind of causes some people to kind of stop up short. Huh? I thought we weren't supposed to call people fool. Well, different wording here. A better translation, although fool is a good one, would probably be you silly person, you. You are just an absolutely silly person. Foolishly silly person. You silly person, you, this very night, I mean, he's gotten the new barns up. He's got all of his loot in the barns. He's now going to have a great big party. He doesn't have to worry about it for years and years and years. And God says, you silly person, you, this very night, your life is being demanded of you. And the things you have prepared, whose will they be? You foolishly silly person, tonight you will die. And all this stuff that you've built up, all these barns you've built, all this money you've amassed, all these goods that you're going to sell someday and make a ton more money on, all of this stuff, whose will it be? You've run off everybody. You have no friends to talk to. You've got to talk to yourself. Whose will this stuff be? So it is, Jesus says. So it is with those who store up treasures for themselves, but are not rich toward God. Oh. Treasures for us. Well, we need things. You know, we need to have houses and cars and clothes and computers and food on the table and televisions to watch and vacation trips to make and all neat clothing to wear and all sorts of neat stuff. I was looking through the latest Almy catalog the other day, and I saw this really pretty stole, and I thought to myself, oh my goodness, that's lovely. And then I looked at the price and said, whoa, it's not that lovely. Yet, I saw it and I liked it. I didn't buy it, but I wanted it. We all know things we want, we think we need. We all know that we need money. And as Jesus says elsewhere, God knows that we need food and clothing and places to live, just as the birds do. But laying up treasures for yourself here on earth, where it's destroyed, where you lose it when you die, doesn't you no good. So it is with those who store up treasures for themselves, but are not rich toward God. What does it mean to be rich toward God? What does it mean to have your whole self-worth, your whole net value, not in your stuff or in your bank account or in God dollar and your ability to earn it, but in God? What does it mean, Brian, for those of us who preach the gospel of Jesus Christ, to find our net worth, to find our value, not in our ordinations or in our degrees or in the adoration of a congregation or in the respect of a bishop or a district superintendent, but in God, where true riches are. Riches that won't die with us. Riches that are eternal. What does it mean for us to find our true value in our true worth, not in things, but in God? That kind of question is almost impossible for us to answer. We live in a society that doesn't value it that way, that judges us based upon the thickness of our bank account or the kind of cars that we drive or the kind of houses that we live in, the kind of clothing that we wear. We live in a society that judges us based upon our toys, our stuff, our things, our barns, not upon our faith, our trust, our love. In working on this sermon, I struggled with this whole question of what it means to be rich towards God and rich in our society. The United States the net worth, different line, the net worth of all United States households, not the government, but households, the net worth of households in the United States is right around $85 trillion, give or take a billion. $85 trillion. It's the net worth of U.S. households today. The top 1% of the population in the United States earns 35% of the entire net worth, owns 35% of the entire net worth, holds 35% of the entire net worth of the country. Now, there are 319 million people in this country. So that's 3,190,000 folk. But not really, because most of that wealth, most of that 35% is owned by just 536 people. Because there are 536 billionaires in the United States. More than any other country by more than double, by the way. Now, the next 4%, after that first percent, the next 4% owns 28% of the entire net worth of households in this country. So in other words, the top 5% of the United States wealth is owned by, the top 5% of the country's wealthy, the top 5% of the country's population owns 63% of the country's wealth. And while there are only 536 billionaires, there are, wait for it, there are 11 million millionaires. That means, interesting, that means that 11 million millionaires and 536 billionaires hold most of that 35%. And the rest of that top 5% are people with less than $1 million. If you have net worth of more than $755,000, you're in the top 5% in the country. Wow. Wow. What about that bottom 40%? We hear about that a lot. The bottom 40% owns less than a fraction of 1% of the net worth of the families, households in this country. And in fact, most of them have a negative net worth. They owe more than they own. That would have described my mother and her family back during the Depression. Mom grew up in Delta County in the 1930s, in the Depression. Prior to the Second World War, my mom's family, my mom's father and mother were sharecroppers. They owned very little. Maybe the clothing on their back and a few implements that are in the house that they lived in, but they were sharecroppers. And yet, as poor as they were, Mom was born in a house that did not have electricity. And yet, as poor as they were, They were wealthy towards God, wealthy towards each other, wealthy in love and joy. My mom's best memories as a child was playing in her mother's yard and her grandmother's yard in Delta County there in Ben Franklin, Texas, playing in the dirt and running out into the fields to take her dad lunch. Some of her best memories are from the days when she had absolutely nothing but was rich in love for family and rich in love of God. Today, she will tell me, and she would tell you, that her biggest worries and headaches are about money. What does it mean to be rich toward God? That rich landowner could have been rich towards God and wealthy too, but he didn't understand, he didn't comprehend that it wasn't the barns that were important. St. Augustine, the bishop of Hippo, a town in North Africa in the 300s A.D., St. Augustine had an interesting interpretation of this passage. He comments that the farmer was planning, quote, to fill himself with excessive and unnecessary feasting and was proudly disregarding all those empty bellies of the poor. He did not realize that the bellies of the poor were much safer storerooms than his barns. Wow. The bellies of the poor were much safer storerooms, much safer barns, much safer receptacles than barns. Why? Because by giving it to those who had need, as God would call us to give, he was not laying up treasures for himself here on earth, but was doing as Jesus would have him do, doing what God would have him do in giving to those in need. He had more than enough. He would have been safer and happier. He wouldn't have had to torn down his barns and build bigger ones. He would have been safer and happier had he simply stored the excess grain and supplies with those who needed it. Then he would have been rich toward God. We are called to do the same. We are called to hear that message and hear the call to being rich toward God. And trust in God that through the gifts of and graces that God has given us to work and to serve and to build, to plant, to reap, to grow, to create, to teach, to preach, to write, to play. Through all the gifts and graces God has given us, God will feed us and protect us and allow us to contribute and be rich toward God. May we be rich toward God and not silly like the farmer, like the rich landowner in the story. What does it mean for us in today's world? What does it mean for us to be rich toward God? In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. And may God's people say amen.
In your presence, Lord, let me learn at your feet. I will taste the riches of your word by your grace upon grace. You set me free.
You have been listening to a sermon by Dr. Gregory Neal, Senior Pastor of the First United Methodist Church in Commerce, Texas, and Rector of Grace Incarnate Ministries. Copyright 2016 by Dr. Gregory S. Neal, all rights reserved. For more information and for other sermons by Dr. Neal, visit us on the web at www.revneal.org. That's www.revneal.org. You are also invited to visit us in person at First United Methodist Church, 1709 Highway 24, Commerce, Texas, 75428. This program was produced by Dr. Greg Neal.